A loving father is shot dead in the street.
It's just hard.
The way he died was a tragedy.
Life will never be the same.
Who would have wanted him dead?
This looks like a robbery.
He was into gambling.
But at the core of this case is a shocking conspiracy.
He was set up.
They got carried away.
This blood is on their hands as well.
In a crime as senseless as it is evil.
It did not have to happen this way.
It wasn't fair at all.
It ruined the life of many people.
This story deserves to be told so that it doesn't happen to anybody else.
January 20th, 2024. It's a Saturday night in Norristown, Pennsylvania. A former industrial town of more than 35,000 located just outside Philadelphia.
At one point, it was a thriving community. Currently, it has economic hardship.
It is an area that has had very notable instances of crime.
So it's not surprising when just before 8 p.m., police get notification of a nearby shooting.
They were alerted by a system in their patrol car called ShotSpotter, which senses gunshots and then has the ability to locate and map them.
There were gunshots from the corner of Powell and Wood.
Police quickly race to the scene.
They discover a man on the ground with a gunshot wound to his head.
The victim was identified as a 35-year-old male by the name of Will Carter.
Growing up, Will Carter was a stereotypical younger brother.
He, drove me crazy. He was a pain in the butt.
But he was like funny. He was like character. He was just full of life.
And there was nothing he wouldn't do for his siblings.
He was always there for the family. That's who he was. Call him, he was there for you.
When Will was a teenager, his life changed unexpectedly once he became a father.
He was 19 when he had his son.
But he wasn't quite ready for the responsibility.
Growing up in the streets, you catch a few and go to jail.
But as he got older, Will pulled his life together.
He became a family man and stayed out of trouble.
He got a steady job in the food services industry.
He ended up getting custody. It's hard to raise boys, especially in the world today. And he was up for it. He just really wanted to be there for his son.
Will was also looking for love. And in 2017, he found it with Tiara James.
I seen Will back in the day, like a few times, and I was like, oh my God, he is so cute. So a few years went past and he hit me up on Facebook and he was like, hey, I've been looking for you. And I'm like, what you looking for me for? Right there, we connected.
And she quickly fell for Will.
His jokes were so corny, but low-key, he was funny. He had a big heart, very genuine. And his smile alone could set the whole room off.
Most importantly, Tiara knew Will was someone she could count on.
That was my go-to person. That was just my right-hand man right there.
Before long, the couple moved in together and formed a loving blended family.
Tiara welcomed his son into the home.
My son actually looked at him as a stepfather. There was nothing that he wouldn't do for my son.
Then, in 2022, the couple got exciting news.
I called him and told him I was pregnant. He came with me to the doctor's appointments. He just wanted to be a part of everything.
And when Will learned they were expecting a girl, he was thrilled.
Having a daughter, that's what made him even happier.
He knew from the rip, we were going to spoil her.
Though Will and Tiara's relationship ultimately ended, they vowed not to let it affect their daughter.
Whatever problems me and Will was having, it really didn't affect how it was going forward. He would still come over. We weren't together, but he was still around. So it was always, when can I come see my baby?
Their little girl was the light of his life.
Them two are like twins. They look alike. They kind of have sort of the same demeanor about them too.
They was just always laughing in their own little zone, like their own world.
She wanted him to walk around in a circle and hold her a certain type of way. He would do it.
Though fully invested in his daughter, Will moved on romantically.
Will started to date a woman named Kay.
And before long, the couple appeared to be taking things to the next level.
They decided to move in together.
But there won't be a happily ever after for Will and Kay.
When the police arrived on scene, Will was on the ground with a gunshot wound to the head.
After first responders declare him dead, a woman rushes out of a nearby house.
The woman is extremely upset.
The woman identifies herself as Tiara James.
She indicated Will is actually her baby's father.
Was this some sort of domestic violence killing?
Although things hadn't worked out between Will Carter and Tiara James, he was still an active father in their one-year-old daughter's life.
He was always there whenever his daughter needed it.
He was an amazing father, and he helped out as often as he could, providing extra support, financial resources.
Will also found happiness again with 30-year-old KML.
It appeared that they were actually getting serious.
They had been living together.
Only now, Will has been gunned down outside of his ex-girlfriend Tiara's home.
It just happens to be on the sidewalk a few doors down from where Tiara actually lives.
And she's on the scene, desperate to help Will.
I said, I gotta go with him to the hospital. One of the police officers kept saying, ma'am, he's gone. I said, what you mean? He said he got shot in the head. He's gone.
While police give Tiara time to collect herself, a detective arrives and begins surveying the scene.
Detectives find 3 9mm casings, and Will did have a pair of car keys on his person, but he had no cash and his cell phone was missing. It kind of immediately jumped off at this is probably a robbery.
Next, officers point the detective in the direction of Tiara.
Thank you, officer. I got it from here. Very sorry for your loss.
Thank you.
Though still in shock, she agrees to walk him through what happened prior to the shooting.
Will called me this afternoon because he wanted to see our daughter.
He had got off of work early. He said, I'm coming to see her.
Tiara explains that Will stayed for a while and then left to run an errand.
But Will came back a little later to spend more time with his daughter.
She says that shortly after he got back, Will asked her for a favor.
Will was into gambling, and he wanted her to place a sports bet.
He asked her to place a $20 bet, but he only had $17.
I said, this is not all the money. So he said, I'll be right back. I said, don't worry about it. It's not that serious. He was like, no, I'll be back.
At which time, he went to the car to get this $3.
Moments later, Tiara heard a popping noise that sounded like gunshots.
My heart dropped. I get up, I look out the window, and I don't see him. So I called his phone 3 times. No answer. I put our daughter in her pack and play. and I started hearing sirens. And I had ran outside and he laying on the ground. And by then, the cops were already there.
But who would have wanted to harm this young father?
As detectives were trying to continue to piece together what happened, they wonder, did he have any problems with people?
Tierra says no, Will is not in the streets at all.
But the detective wants to know more about his gambling.
And they hear that Will was placing a bet. They wonder, did he owe anyone money?
But they find out Will just won a substantial amount of money in a bet.
Did he ever talk to you about how much?
No.
It really wasn't my concern of, oh, did you win? How much? Gimme. Like, I didn't need to know all that.
When asked if she had any problems with Will, she denies it.
She says no, everything was fine.
In fact, she claims that things were so good, they were talking about getting back together.
Me and William at that time that this happened was actually trying to work things out for the sake of us and our daughter.
And that's when suddenly Tierra says she's realized who might have done this.
I was asking myself, who could have did this? He didn't have any enemies, none of that. And then it clicked to me.
You have to talk to Kay,
I'm sorry, who?
a girl Will used to mess with.
Tierra explains that not long after she and Will broke up, he and Kay started dating.
From the get-go, this woman made it clear she didn't like Tierra.
She would just try to create like this beef between me and William so that I guess I could stay away from him. She would go as far as to say, oh, well, he told me that baby's not his.
Initially, Tierra says Kay's plan worked.
That kind of caused like friction between me and him. Because it's like, okay, if you dealing with this girl, go ahead and put her in her place. You're here with your daughter.
But in the end, Will made clear where Kay really stood.
He and Kay broke up in July of 2023.
And now, Tierra has a strong instinct Kay may have been involved in Will's murder.
How much I didn't know, but there's something wasn't right about her.
Could Kay's envy have sparked this crime?
You have a jealous ex-girlfriend who sees her ex getting back together with the mother of his child. These kind of situations can be explosive and can lead to murder.
Or was it possible Tierra was spinning a story to protect herself?
She could be making this all up, possibly because of a desire for revenge on Kay, or because Tierra herself has something to do with the crime and was trying to lay blame elsewhere.
But the detective also thinks there could be a much simpler explanation for Will's murder.
When he left, did he have his cell phone on him?
Yeah,
You sure?
I saw it.
Clearly, his phone was taken.
This looks like it could be a robbery.
By the time investigators finish their interview, officers have linked the keys found on Will to a nearby vehicle.
When they look further into that, the car is registered to Kay.
A more thorough search of the car further supports that Will may have been robbed.
There was no money and there was no phone.
But was theft the real motive? Police may have a way to find out.
They noticed a security camera facing that location across the street.
Give me that footage as soon as possible.
The footage is a gold mine.
The entire crime was captured.
A detective investigating the murder of 35-year-old Will Carter has located security footage from a camera that points directly toward the crime scene.
The detectives end up pulling the security camera footage.
The entire crime was captured.
Scrolling through the footage, the detective first notes an SUV arriving a little before 8 and parking right behind Will's vehicle.
The SUV turns off the light, but no one exits the car.
Around the same time, Will comes outside.
You can see Will coming from the direction of Tiara's house, carrying his cell phone.
He walks right past the SUV.
Not at any point did he even look, or it seemed like that he was even aware that anyone was in that vehicle.
He opens his car door and it appears as if he's looking for something.
Kind of consistent with this story that Tiara was saying, that he was going to go get $3. He closed the door and turns the direction he came from.
As he passes the SUV, 3 men jump out and rush him.
One was the front seat passenger, and then 2 people from the back of the vehicle.
One of the men pulls out a 9mm handgun, and it appears to have an extended clip.
An extended clip is an attachment for a gun that increases the amount of ammunition that can be fired before reloading.
They pin him against the wall. They go through his pockets.
And this is all happening right underneath the camera.
As the men race away, the assailant with the gun turns back toward Will.
He fires off 3 rounds in rapid succession.
Will is hit in the head and he falls to the ground.
The rounds come out of the gun so fast that the police are sure that an illegal switch had been installed to make the weapon operate like an automatic.
Almost immediately, the 3 assailants jump back into the SUV.
The driver already had headlights on. They were ready to move out as soon as these guys returned.
The video leaves no doubt that Will was the victim of a robbery.
Just looking at the video in itself, it was pretty obvious.
But this doesn't look like a random attack.
The location was very unusual for a random style robbery. You had medical offices, not places where people will be expecting people with money to be showing up in the middle of the night. And this vehicle parks directly behind Will's vehicle, turns the lights off, sits there, and then Will comes back and he's pretty much immediately taken out.
The men essentially laid and waited for him.
This was an intentional hit.
But who had targeted him?
Was this from someone who knew that he had won a bunch of money?
Although it isn't possible to clearly identify anyone in the video, police hope the footage will help them find the suspects.
This video not only shows the crime, but it shows the vehicle they drove off in, shows what they're wearing.
The shooter, you can see he had distinctive warm-up pants, distinctive high-top boots.
And that's a major, major thing for detectives to have.
After enhancing the images, detectives release them to the press.
They're seeking tips. They're trying to find out who committed this crime.
As they were investigating, it's like you want to know. Every day that went past, it's just like, what's going on? You want to pick up the phone and be like, hey, did you find anything else?
Before long, investigators get an unexpected new lead in the case.
All right. 7 hours after the crime was reported, there was a call that it was an arson not too far away from the scene. There was a car that was set on fire.
And it's an SUV that matches the one in the surveillance video.
While investigating the murder of Will Carter, Norristown police have learned that someone has torched what appears to be the suspect's vehicle a few blocks from the crime scene.
Several hours after the murder, firefighters and police get a call not far from the scene for an SUV on fire.
It's the same model as the SUV seen in the video footage capturing Will Carter's killing.
By the time the detective arrives, the fire is out. But it's clear this was no accident.
This was definitely arson.
The scene smelled of gasoline.
The vehicle's license plate was removed, and the officer who arrived on the scene reported someone running away from the scene in dark clothing.
The vehicle is towed in for processing, and investigators arranged to speak with Will's ex-girlfriend, KML.
They want to see what she might know, or if she could somehow be involved.
Distraught, Kay immediately says that she already heard about Will's passing.
I'm still in shock.
When the detective asks her about the couple's breakup, she says it wasn't what she wanted.
She was like, oh, he is the love of my life, and I can't believe this happened.
So there were no problems between you two?
No, we were very cordial.
In fact, she tells police they were still living together.
And she often lets Will borrow her car.
Kay also admits that she knew Will had recently won a large sum of money.
Yeah, I think he won like $3,000.
But when the detective asks if she had any expectations that he would give her some of his winnings, she says no.
She explains that after their breakup, they were no longer splitting the bills, and Will did not share any of the money with her.
He won $3,000 and didn't share it with you. Did it upset you?
Look, I didn't have anything to do with it, if that's what you're implying.
But she says she may be able to help find who did.
She heard third hand from a friend that a man named Daquan Allen may have been involved.
How did Will and Daquan know each other?
Drugs.
She said Daquan Allen was actually Will's coke dealer.
Maybe Will owed Daquan money and he saw this killing as a way to get it back.
Kay stated that she's been with him on a few occasions when he met up with Allen, but she's not really familiar with Allen.
Police, however, are quite familiar with him.
He's a known dealer in Norristown.
But can investigators tie Daquan to the crime?
There's nothing on the surveillance video that clearly makes Daquan identifiable.
But the SUV might be another story.
The fire actually gutted at the SUV, but one thing that was salvageable was the VIN number.
When the detective types the VIN into a database, he gets a hit.
It turns up that SUV had been reported stolen.
So he takes things one step further.
They search a database that has records from license plate readers. When you pass by, it grabs a picture of your license plate, can identify the letters and the numbers and even the state tags.
And the vehicle's license plate has recently been captured on camera.
The police get a hit on the license plates 4 days prior to the murder.
When they locate the surveillance footage, it shows a person known to police getting into the passenger side of the vehicle.
And when they track down the passenger, they're able to learn that the vehicle was in possession of 17-year-old Damon Brantley Jr.
Investigators are able to get a search warrant for the apartment Damon shares with his girlfriend.
Detectives head over to their home.
When they speak with his girlfriend, she claims she doesn't know where Damon is.
She said she hadn't seen him since Saturday because she kicked him out after they got into an argument.
But during the search, they uncover incriminating evidence.
They'd find ammunition for a 9mm handgun.
And they find an extended magazine for a 9mm, which was also consistent with what was noticed in the individual's hand in the surveillance video.
After seizing the ammunition and magazine, police return to the station to search for digital evidence that could tie Damon to the crime.
They reviewed the data from Damon's girlfriend's phone along with several other people known to associate with him.
Once they go through the records, they find there was actually a picture of Damon, which puts him in the driver's seat of that SUV, as well as a photo of him holding a 9mm handgun. They also find a text exchange between Damon's girlfriend and another female.
They talk about how they know he was involved in the crime and how they recognized him on the surveillance footage that was on the news.
And there's more bad news for Damon.
Right now.
Detectives end up getting a call from the school resource officer at Norristown High School.
He recognizes the outfit in the video footage that had been going out in the media.
He tells him he saw Damon hours before the murder at the high school basketball game.
Damon's clothing were consistent with the clothing that the shooter in the video was wearing.
When detectives review surveillance from the high school, it confirms their suspicions.
There's Damon, and he's wearing what appears to be the same clothes as the suspect from the surveillance video.
Detectives are pretty much convinced that Damon is the shooter.
But where is Damon Brantley Jr. now?
Damon, at this point, is nowhere to be found.
But thanks to his call logs, they discover another person of interest.
Around the time of the shooting, Damon, he had numerous calls with 16-year-old Justin Davis.
Later that day, investigators bring Justin in for questioning.
He's a minor, and he is present with his mother.
Under questioning, Justin claims he doesn't know anything about the events of January 20th.
Right on the night of January 20th.
He denies having anything to do with Will's murder.
With nothing but phone calls to potentially link him to the crime, police can't hold him.
So police let him go.
But not 24 hours later, he's back.
The next day, Justin's mom calls police, and she says they're gonna come in.
He has something he needs to tell the detectives.
One day after 16-year-old Justin Davis's first interview with Norristown police, his mother contacts investigators.
Homicide.
Apparently, Justin has a little bit more to share.
When she brings him in, he admits he lied to police.
Justin gives a different story than what he gave to detectives prior.
He confessed that he took part in the robbery and murder of Will Carter.
From there, Justin cooperates, helping police to identify the other suspects in the surveillance video from the scene.
That's me. That's Damon.
He confirms that Damon Brantley Jr. is the shooter.
The third man was a 28-year-old male named Jerry Butler.
He says the driver of the vehicle, he only knows him as Day Day.
Suspecting that Day Day is Daquan Allen, the detective pulls his picture to show Justin.
He confirms it is Daquan.
Justin also walks the detective through what happened after the shooting.
They immediately drove a few blocks away, and Justin, Jerry, and Daquan all got into another vehicle. Damon was left in possession of the SUV.
And everyone else headed to Philly.
Nonetheless, Justin is all but certain it was Damon who later set fire to the getaway vehicle.
The next day, he FaceTimed Damon. He noticed that Damon had burns on his face.
When police ask Justin if anyone else was involved in the crime, he reveals something surprising.
Hours before the murder took place, Justin heard Daquan talking to a woman on the phone.
He said it was an owner of the car that they parked behind on the night of the murder.
In which they know belongs to Will's old girlfriend, Kay.
And it was clear Kay wasn't happy with Will.
Kay told Daquan that Will had recently won a bunch of money and didn't give her any.
And it seems Daquan immediately saw this as an opportunity to make some fast cash.
That's when Daquan suggested that they rob him.
According to Justin, Kay not only didn't object, but also helped Daquan get the job done.
She knew where he was gonna be.
Kay told possible locations where they can find Will.
This was an orchestrated hit.
Justin says after the murder, Kay called Daquan to ask for her share of the money.
He told Kay to find a way into Philly
Daquan and her did in fact meet up and that cash was exchanged.
But Daquan told the group that Kay called him again that night. And it seemed like their decision was weighing on her.
Daquan gave her a warning about going to the police, was saying that cooperating with the police would not be in your best interest.
He said that she would actually be held more responsible for the murder.
She was the one that gave them all of the information to find Will.
Though investigators need more to corroborate Kay's involvement, they have enough to issue warrants for the arrests of Justin Davis, Daquan Allen, Damon Brantley Jr., and Jerry Butler.
They are all charged with murder, and Justin Davis is taken into custody on site while the other 3 remain fugitives.
But with the help of U.S. Marshals, it doesn't take long to locate them.
Law enforcement were able to track the 3 to a house in Endicott, New York.
And that's where Marshals placed Daquan, Damon, and Jerry under arrest.
They end up taking them into custody.
When they told me that they finally arrested the young men that were involved, the only thing I could do was thank God. It was just like a slight breath of fresh air.
And after pulling Daquan's phone records, investigators are anticipating a 5th arrest.
On Saturday night, just prior to and directly following the murder of Will, there were 14 calls between Daquan and Kay.
It appears Justin was telling the truth.
On February 5th, the detective, now armed with new evidence, questions Kay again.
Confronted with everything, Kay quickly crumbles.
She confesses to setting him up.
But she said it wasn't supposed to happen like this.
We weren't supposed to kill him.
On February 5th, after Norristown police confront KML with the evidence against her in the murder of Will Carter, she quickly breaks.
She confesses to setting Will up.
But she swears no one was supposed to die.
We weren't supposed to kill him.
It was just supposed to be a robbery.
Kay now admits that her relationship with her ex was far less rosy than she first let on.
Although their breakup was more or less amicable, tensions between her and Will had been building since November.
He stopped helping her with the rent, even though he still continued to live with her.
Kay says her frustration grew after Will won big gambling.
Will showed her the money, but didn't give her any of it.
She wanted to get some level of financial support.
The day of the murder, her frustration boiled over, and she began venting to Daquan Allen.
Will's coke dealer.
Well, no, actually.
It came out that she lied. William was not on coke at all.
In fact, it was Kay who was buying from Daquan.
Daquan was her ecstasy dealer.
And when Kay complained that Will wouldn't give her any of his winnings, Daquan got an idea.
His response was, let's rob him.
She said that she didn't object, but Daquan did all the planning, including recruiting the 3 other men.
But is Kay trying to downplay her role in the crime?
Police remind her of the 14 calls she made to Daquan.
You sure?
Yes.
Because everything you said, it sounds like you're the one who set him up.
I knew where Will was going to be.
She provided Daquan with Will's location just prior to the robbery.
But she says nothing could have prepared her for the news she received after it was all over.
Daquan told her after the incident that the young men had gotten carried away.
Will had died from a gunshot to the head.
Although despite her shock, Kay still wanted her share of Will's money.
Shortly after, she called Daquan and requested that he meet her.
Daquan meets Kay in Philadelphia, and there he hands her $700 cash.
If she was really so broken up over Will, why was she so gung-ho to get his money?
At the end of her interview, Kay is placed under arrest and charged with second-degree murder.
Whether she intended for Will to die or not, she was still a part of what happened to him. When you plan a crime, there's no guarantee what the outcome will be.
News of Kay's arrest is a relief for Will's loved ones.
When they called and told me, I could not stop shaking, I could not stop crying because I knew she had something to do with it.
I was happy because it was like, you set this up, but then you want to try to play this victim role, and you're not a victim.
As the case moves forward, Kay cooperates with investigators.
Prosecutors need her testimony to be able to pin the other suspects involved. And so they strike a deal with her.
She has to testify against the other defendants.
In exchange for her testimony, she pled guilty to third-degree murder.
This took life imprisonment off the table, but her actual sentence, which could still be as steep as 40 years, would not be determined until her testimony was complete.
16-year-old Justin Davis also makes a deal with prosecutors.
He ultimately pled to third-degree murder and conspiracy to commit robbery.
Because he was only 16 at the time of the murder, he will spend time in a juvenile facility until he turns 21.
And then he'll have 5 years probation following that.
On September 11th, 2024, when the trial of Damon, Jerry, and Daquan begins, it's a difficult time for Will's family.
It was very, very hard to have to go through the trial. It felt like it was a game to them, like it was a joke.
In the prosecution's opening statement, they lay out each defendant's role in the crime.
Daquan was actually the brains behind the operation. Jerry was the muscle, and Damon was the actual trigger man.
But they also emphasize that the three defendants are equally responsible under the law.
Even if one did not intend to murder with weapons, the risk trumps intention, and their actions led to the death of 35-year-old Will Carter.
To prove their case, prosecutors have strong circumstantial evidence.
In this case, it all came together, pulling phone records and pulling security camera footage. Then they had the testimony of Justin.
He was able to give a first-person account of what happened on the day of the crime and identify everybody in the video.
But their star witness is Kay.
She lays the foundation for how and why the crime happened.
When asked why she initially lied to police, she claims she didn't want to snitch.
She didn't want anyone to get in trouble.
When it's the defense's turn, they question Kay's credibility.
The defense says maybe Kay is only saying what the prosecution wants her to say to save her own skin.
But who will the jury believe?
When the jury returns, they find all three defendants guilty.
Daquan and Jerry are convicted of second-degree murder, while Damon is convicted of first-degree murder.
When Daquan and Jerry are sentenced on September 19th, 2024, they both receive stiff penalties.
Daquan Allen is sentenced to life in a state correctional facility. Jerry Butler also gets life in prison.
When Damon Brantley Jr. is sentenced, his part in the murder earns him 50 to 100 years behind bars.
And the reason why he did not get a life sentence is because at the time of the incident, he was 17 years of age.
1 month later, when Kay's punishment is handed down, it feels like a slap in the face to Will's loved ones.
In exchange for her testimony, Kay is sentenced to 6 to 15 years.
I feel like she should not see daylight again, because without her, it wouldn't happen. He would still be here to this day.
Today, Will's friends and family still struggle with his loss.
It's just hard for him not to be here with us.
Life will never be the same. My daughter won't be able to experience William Carter, his personality, his laugh, his hugs.
For his son to know that his father lost his life the way that he did, it's playing a major impact on him. I pray for him every day.
But Will's family hopes that some good can come from this senseless crime.
The way he died was a tragedy. He deserves his story to be told so that it doesn't happen to anybody else.
And it's just that it's
For more than 3 decades, one question haunted a small Arizona community. Who killed Celestina Perez? For 31 years, her name remained attached to one of the state's most painful cold cases. A woman disappeared from the ordinary rhythm of everyday life, leaving behind a family searching for answers, investigators chasing fragments of evidence, and a community trapped between hope and uncertainty. The years passed. Seasons changed. Children grew older. Witnesses moved away. Memories faded. But one mystery refused to disappear. On a quiet day in Arizona, a crime that had remained unsolved for decades suddenly returned to the headlines. A case that many feared would never be solved was reopened by a new generation of investigators using new technology, new methods, and a determination to uncover the truth buried beneath years of silence. The victim was Celestina Perez, a woman whose life was taken in a moment of violence, a woman whose family spent decades waiting for justice, and a woman whose killer believed time would erase the evidence. But time did something else. It preserved the mystery. It kept the question alive. And eventually it brought investigators closer to the answer. The story began in Arizona, in an era when forensic technology was far different from what it is today. DNA testing was still in its early stages. Digital databases did not exist in the way they do now. Investigators depended heavily on eyewitness accounts, physical evidence collected at crime scenes, and the ability to connect small details through traditional police work. In many cases, that was enough. But in cases like Celestina Perez's, it created a nightmare. A crime scene could hold the truth. But if investigators did not yet have the tools to read it, the truth could remain hidden for years. Celestina was not a headline. She was not a mystery. Before she became known as a cold case victim, she was a person with a family, a daily routine, and a future that was suddenly stolen. Those who knew her remembered more than the tragedy that followed. They remembered a woman who had people who loved her. A woman whose absence was immediately felt. A woman whose disappearance was not just another police report. For her family, the first days after she vanished were filled with fear. At first, there was uncertainty. Maybe she had gone somewhere unexpectedly. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe she would come home. But as hours turned into days, that hope began to collapse. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. And then came the devastating discovery that transformed a missing person investigation into a murder case. Celestina Perez had been killed. The shock spread through the community. A woman who had once been part of everyday life was suddenly at the center of a violent mystery. The question that followed was immediate and terrifying. Who could have wanted her dead? Investigators began the difficult process of reconstructing her final moments. They examined the crime scene. They searched for evidence. They interviewed people connected to Celestina. They looked for anything that could explain why someone would commit such a brutal act. But from the beginning, the case presented challenges. There was no easy answer. No obvious suspect. No confession. No single piece of evidence that immediately revealed the person responsible. Instead, investigators were left with fragments. Small pieces of a puzzle scattered across time. Every cold case begins with a moment when the investigation slows down. For Celestina Perez's case, that moment came after the initial wave of investigative activity. Police followed leads. They considered possibilities. They searched for connections. But the evidence was not enough to bring the person responsible to justice. And eventually, the case grew quiet. The files remained. The questions remained. But the world moved forward. That is the cruel reality of a cold case. The victim's family continues living with the pain, while the person responsible may continue living an ordinary life. A killer can go to work. A killer can walk through public places. A killer can build relationships. And somewhere beneath that normal appearance may exist the secret of a crime that has never been answered. For 31 years, that possibility remained. The person who killed Celestina Perez was out there, and investigators had no way of knowing who it was. But cold cases are not always forgotten. Sometimes they wait. They wait for technology to advance. They wait for someone to review old evidence. They wait for a new investigator to look at the same facts with a different perspective. And sometimes, they wait for the smallest detail to become the detail that changes everything. Decades after Celestina's death, investigators returned to the case. Not because they had forgotten, because they had not. Behind every cold case file is a victim. Behind every piece of evidence is a story. And behind every unanswered question is a family still waiting. The investigation that began in the late 20th century would eventually enter a new era. A time when science could reveal what human memory could not. A time when evidence once considered impossible to use could become the key to unlocking a mystery. The old files were examined again. The details were revisited. The timeline was reconstructed. Investigators searched for what had been missed. Because after 31 years, the question was no longer whether the case could be solved. The question was whether the person responsible had finally run out of places to hide. For decades, Celestina Perez's name represented an unfinished story. A life interrupted. A family left waiting. A crime without an ending. But behind the silence of those years, something was changing. The investigation was moving again. And the person who believed the past would remain buried was about to discover one of the most frightening truths in criminal investigations. Time does not always protect the guilty. Sometimes, time is what finally exposes them. For 31 years, the murder of Celestina Perez remained a wound that never fully healed. The passage of time created distance, but it never created closure. Her family continued carrying the weight of unanswered questions. The community that once searched for answers was left with only memories, rumors, and the painful reality that the person responsible had never been held accountable. But inside law enforcement files, the case was never truly gone. It remained. A name. A photograph. A collection of evidence. A reminder that somewhere, someone knew more than they had ever admitted. The investigators who first handled the case faced the limitations of their era. In the early stages of the investigation, detectives relied on the tools available at the time. Interviews had to be conducted carefully. Witness statements had to be compared. Physical evidence had to be preserved, even if science had not yet developed the ability to fully analyze it. The evidence was there, but the technology needed to unlock its secrets had not yet arrived. This is the frustrating reality behind many cold cases. A crime scene can hold the identity of a killer for decades. A fingerprint, a biological sample, a trace of contact, a piece of information overlooked because, at that moment in history, investigators had no way to understand its importance. For Celestina Perez, those years became a long battle between silence and justice. Her family had to live with a painful uncertainty that no one should experience. The person who took Celestina's life was not a mystery from history. The person was real. The person had a name. The person had once stood close enough to commit an unimaginable act. And yet, that person remained beyond reach. As decades passed, the world around the case changed. Arizona changed. Law enforcement changed. Technology changed. The way investigators approached unsolved murders changed completely. The arrival of advanced DNA analysis transformed criminal investigations across the United States. Evidence collected years earlier could now be examined with methods that detectives from previous generations could never have imagined. Old cases were being reopened. Old evidence was being tested. Old assumptions were being questioned. And for many families who had spent years waiting, there was finally a new possibility. Justice was no longer limited by the calendar. A murder committed decades earlier could still lead investigators to the person responsible. The past could finally speak. For Celestina Perez's case, the turning point came when investigators decided to take another look. The case was not reopened because of a dramatic new confession. There was no sudden stranger walking into a police station with a shocking admission. Instead, like many successful cold case investigations, the breakthrough came through patience, persistence, and a willingness to examine what had already been there. Detectives began reviewing the evidence with fresh eyes. They looked back at the original investigation. They studied the information collected years earlier. They searched for connections that may have been invisible in the past. A cold case investigation is often a battle against time. Memories become unreliable. People disappear. Witnesses pass away. Details become harder to verify. But evidence has a different quality. Evidence can survive. And sometimes, evidence remembers what people forget. The investigators working on Celestina's case understood that solving the murder would require more than simply reopening old files. They needed to rebuild the story. They needed to understand who Celestina was, where she had been, who had been around her, and what happened during the final moments of her life. Every victim leaves behind a timeline, a trail of ordinary moments, a final day, a last conversation, a last sighting, a last opportunity for someone to intervene. Investigators followed those pieces carefully. They searched for inconsistencies. They examined relationships. They considered people connected to Celestina's life. Because in homicide investigations, the person responsible is often not a random figure from the shadows. Often, the answer is closer than anyone wants to believe. The challenge was identifying which connection mattered, which detail was significant, which piece of the past could finally reveal the truth. For years, the case had existed in uncertainty. Now, investigators had a new mission: find the person who believed they had escaped forever. The possibility that the killer had lived freely for 3 decades made the case even more disturbing. 31 years is enough time for an entire life to change. A person can move. A person can create a new identity. A person can build a family. A person can convince themselves that the crime is behind them. But investigators know something criminals often forget. A case does not disappear simply because time passes. The evidence may become older. The memories may become weaker. But the truth remains. And when investigators began applying modern forensic methods to the old evidence connected to Celestina's murder, the investigation entered a new chapter. The same evidence that once failed to provide answers began producing new possibilities. The case that had once seemed frozen began moving again. For Celestina's family, this renewed attention brought a complicated mixture of emotions. Hope, fear, pain. After so many years, the idea of answers finally coming was both comforting and heartbreaking. Because solving a murder does not erase the loss. It does not bring back the person who was taken. It does not restore the years stolen from a family. But justice matters. A victim's name deserves to be remembered for more than the crime committed against them. And a family deserves to know that the person responsible cannot hide forever. As investigators continued their work, the question that had followed the case for 3 decades became more urgent. Who was the person who killed Celestina Perez? And how had they managed to remain free for so long? The answer was buried somewhere between the evidence collected decades earlier and the modern science now examining it. A hidden connection. A forgotten clue. A piece of the puzzle waiting for the right moment. The investigation was no longer looking backward. It was moving toward a confrontation, because after 31 years of silence, the walls around the mystery were beginning to close. The killer had spent decades believing the past was gone. But the past had been waiting. Waiting for technology. Waiting for investigators. Waiting for justice. And soon, the case that had haunted Arizona for generations would reveal the first signs of the person who had been hiding in plain sight. For decades, the murder of Celestina Perez existed as a painful reminder that some questions can survive longer than anyone expects. The years continued moving forward. The world changed. Technology advanced. Entire generations grew up without knowing the name behind one of Arizona's most haunting unsolved crimes. But for those closest to Celestina, time never truly moved on. Every anniversary carried the same painful reality. The person responsible had never answered for what happened. There had been no courtroom, no confession, no moment when justice finally arrived. Only memories. Only questions. Only the unbearable thought that someone had taken a life and continued living freely. But cold cases have a strange quality. They can appear silent while investigations continue beneath the surface. A file may sit untouched for years, but one new discovery can suddenly bring everything back into focus. That is exactly what happened with the case of Celestina Perez. The investigation entered a new phase when detectives began using modern forensic techniques to examine evidence collected decades earlier. What had once been considered the end of the road became the beginning of a new search. The rules had changed. The technology had changed. And evidence that had remained quiet for 31 years was finally capable of telling its story. In modern homicide investigations, DNA has become one of the most powerful tools available to detectives. A microscopic trace left behind at a crime scene can connect a person to an event that happened years, even decades earlier. It does not rely on memory. It does not depend on someone deciding to tell the truth. It creates a scientific connection, a link between the past and the present. For investigators revisiting Celestina's case, the challenge was finding that connection. They knew the answer existed somewhere within the evidence. The question was whether they could uncover it. The process required patience. Cold case detectives understand that solving a decades-old murder is rarely about one dramatic moment. It is about hundreds of small decisions. Reviewing old reports, re-examining photographs, looking at evidence with modern understanding, questioning previous conclusions. A case that once seemed impossible can suddenly change when investigators ask a simple question. What did we miss? The murder of Celestina Perez was no longer viewed only as a tragedy from the past. It became an active investigation again. Detectives began reconstructing the events surrounding her death. They looked at the people connected to her life. They examined the circumstances that surrounded the crime. They searched for the person who had the opportunity, the motive, and the access to commit such a devastating act. Because every murder tells a story. The victim's story, the offender's story, and the story of the evidence left behind. The difficulty was that the killer had been given something many criminals never receive. Time. 3 decades allowed memories to fade, relationships to change, lives to be rebuilt. The person responsible had decades to believe they had escaped. But investigators knew something different. They knew that time does not erase evidence. It only delays discovery. As the renewed investigation progressed, the focus shifted toward identifying the individual connected to the evidence. A name began emerging. A person who had been part of the investigation's unanswered questions. A person whose connection to the crime would eventually become impossible to ignore. The breakthrough did not come from luck. It came from persistence. From detectives who refused to accept that a case involving a murdered woman should remain unanswered forever. The case represented something larger than a single investigation. It represented every family waiting for justice. Every victim whose story remained unfinished. Every cold case file sitting somewhere, holding secrets that had not yet been revealed. For Celestina's loved ones, the renewed investigation brought back emotions they had carried for decades. The pain returned. The memories returned. The questions returned. But alongside the pain was something that had been missing for years. Hope. Hope that someone would finally be held accountable. Hope that Celestina's name would no longer be connected only with an unsolved murder. Hope that the person responsible would finally face the consequences of what they had done. But even as investigators moved closer to answers, the case remained complicated. A suspect identification is only the beginning. Investigators must build a case. They must prove the connection. They must separate suspicion from evidence. They must create a timeline that explains not only who was responsible, but how and why. A successful prosecution requires more than a theory. It requires proof. And after 31 years, detectives knew they had to be precise. Every detail mattered. Every piece of evidence mattered. Every decision mattered. Because the person they were searching for had already escaped justice for more than 3 decades. The investigation could not fail. The evidence had to speak clearly. The story had to be reconstructed. And the truth had to finally emerge. As detectives continued digging deeper, the mystery surrounding Celestina Perez's murder began to lose its power. The darkness that had surrounded the case for so long was beginning to disappear. The unanswered questions were becoming fewer. The distance between the crime and the killer was becoming smaller. And somewhere in Arizona, the person responsible for Celestina's death was about to discover that the one thing they had counted on for protection, time, had become the very thing that exposed them. For 31 years, the killer had lived with a secret. For 31 years, a family waited. For 31 years, a community wondered. But the investigation was no longer standing still. The cold case was heating up, and the next discovery would change everything. For 31 years, the name Celestina Perez represented a question that refused to disappear. A woman had been taken from her family. A community had been left searching for answers. And somewhere in the silence between the crime and the investigation, the person responsible had managed to remain hidden. But every cold case has a moment when the past begins to move. For Celestina Perez, that moment came when investigators discovered that the old evidence still had something to say. The case was no longer just a forgotten file stored away in an archive. It was alive again. Detectives understood that solving a murder after 3 decades required more than simply reopening the investigation. They had to reconstruct a story that had been interrupted by time. They needed to understand Celestina's final moments. They needed to understand the circumstances surrounding her death. And most importantly, they needed to understand who had been close enough to take her life and then disappear into the passing years. The investigation became a careful examination of everything connected to the case. Old reports were reviewed. Previous interviews were studied. Evidence was analyzed with new technology. Names that had once appeared briefly in the investigation were reconsidered. Because in a cold case, the smallest detail can become the most important. A statement that seemed insignificant decades earlier may suddenly reveal a contradiction. A piece of evidence once considered impossible to analyze may provide a breakthrough. A person who was once overlooked may become the center of the investigation. This was the challenge facing detectives. They were not only searching for a suspect, they were searching for the missing piece that connected the past to the present. The murder of Celestina Perez had always carried a disturbing question. How could someone commit such a violent act and remain unknown for so long? The answer often lies in the reality of criminal investigations. Many killers are not caught because they are invisible. They are caught because one mistake eventually comes to light. A forgotten detail, a scientific discovery, a connection that investigators could not see before. The person responsible may believe they have escaped. They may believe years have erased suspicion. They may believe the world has forgotten. But investigators know that evidence does not forget. As the renewed investigation continued, detectives began narrowing their focus. They looked beyond the crime itself and into the relationships surrounding Celestina. Who knew her? Who had contact with her? Who had a reason to harm her? Who was present during the time when her life ended? Every homicide investigation is built around opportunity and access. The person responsible had to be connected to the circumstances of the crime. They had to have the ability to commit the act. And they had to leave behind something that could eventually reveal the truth. For years, that connection remained hidden. But advances in forensic science changed the balance of power. The evidence that had once failed to identify a suspect was now being examined through a completely different lens. DNA technology had transformed investigations across the country. Cases that seemed impossible were suddenly being solved. Victims who had waited decades were finally receiving justice. Families who had spent years wondering if they would ever know the truth were finally hearing answers. And investigators working on Celestina's case knew that possibility existed for them as well. The investigation moved forward carefully. Every discovery had to be confirmed. Every connection had to be tested. Every possibility had to be examined. Because after 31 years, emotions could not replace evidence. The goal was not simply to identify a person. The goal was to prove what happened, to create a timeline, to show how the crime unfolded, to give Celestina Perez the justice that had been delayed for so long. As detectives continued their work, the case began revealing a disturbing pattern familiar to many cold case investigations. The person responsible had not been defeated by time. They had been protected by it. For decades, the absence of answers created a false sense of security. The killer had watched the world move on. They had watched the headlines disappear. They had watched investigators reach dead ends. And perhaps they believed that the passage of years had destroyed any chance of being caught. But they were wrong. Because while memories faded, evidence remained. While people forgot details, science preserved the truth. And while the killer moved forward through life, the investigation was quietly waiting for the right moment. That moment had arrived. The breakthrough came from the careful examination of the past. The same crime scene that had once provided only questions now began providing answers. The investigation was no longer searching blindly. Detectives had a direction. They had a path. And that path was leading them toward the person who had spent decades believing they would never be discovered. But identifying a suspect was only one part of the battle. The next challenge was even more difficult. Could investigators prove that this was the person responsible? Could they build a case strong enough to survive the courtroom? Could they finally deliver justice for Celestina Perez after more than 3 decades of uncertainty? The pressure was enormous. Because cold cases are not only investigations. They are promises. Promises made to victims. Promises made to families. Promises that even if justice takes years, it will not be abandoned. For Celestina's loved ones, the possibility of an arrest brought emotions that were impossible to describe. After years of waiting, the nightmare that began decades earlier was finally moving toward an ending. But before there could be closure, there had to be accountability. The person responsible had to face the consequences. The truth had to be presented. And the final chapter of Celestina Perez's story had to be written. The investigation had crossed the most difficult distance of all. It had traveled back through 31 years of silence. It had returned to a crime that many thought would remain forever unanswered. And now, the question that had haunted Arizona for decades was closer than ever to being solved. Who killed Celestina Perez? The answer was no longer buried in the past. It was waiting. And soon, the world would learn the identity of the person who had carried that secret for 31 years. For decades, the murder of Celestina Perez remained one of those cases that seemed destined to become a permanent mystery. A crime without an ending. A victim without justice. A family forced to live with questions that had no answers. But behind the silence, investigators were still searching. The passage of 31 years had changed almost everything about the world around the case. Technology had advanced. Investigative methods had evolved. The tools available to detectives in the modern era were unlike anything investigators could have imagined when Celestina's murder first occurred. And now, those tools were being used to revisit the evidence. Evidence that had waited for decades. Evidence that had survived when memories disappeared. Evidence that would eventually point investigators toward the person responsible. The turning point in a cold case rarely arrives with a dramatic moment. It is usually the result of persistence. A detective reviewing old records late at night. A forensic analyst examining material that had been stored for years. A question that had never been fully answered. A detail that had been overlooked because the technology did not exist to understand its importance. For Celestina Perez, the breakthrough came from the combination of old evidence and new science. The investigation entered a new stage. Detectives were no longer simply asking what happened. They were asking who was responsible. And after 3 decades, that question finally had a possible answer. The process of identifying a suspect required investigators to carefully rebuild the events surrounding Celestina's death. They examined the timeline. They looked at the people connected to her. They studied the circumstances that surrounded the crime. Every piece of information mattered. Because in a case that had remained unsolved for so long, the smallest detail could become the foundation of justice. Investigators understood that they were not only solving a murder, they were restoring a story that had been interrupted. Celestina Perez was more than a name in a police report. She was a person whose life had meaning. A person remembered by family and friends. A person whose future was stolen. And after 31 years, investigators were determined that her story would not end with uncertainty. As the investigation moved forward, detectives began focusing on the possibility that the answer had been closer than anyone realized. Many cold cases are not solved because a completely new suspect suddenly appears. They are solved because investigators finally understand the significance of someone or something that had been there all along. The past does not change, but the way investigators see the past can change everything. The evidence connected to Celestina's murder began creating a clearer picture. The unknown figure who had remained hidden for decades was slowly becoming visible. A suspect began to emerge. A person who had once been part of the unanswered questions surrounding the case. A person whose connection to Celestina would eventually become the center of the investigation. For investigators, this was the moment where patience had to overcome emotion. After so many years, there was a natural desire to finally name the person responsible. But detectives knew the importance of building a case carefully. A suspicion is not enough. A theory is not enough. A case must survive examination. It must withstand challenges. It must tell a complete story. The evidence had to show not only that a person was connected to the crime, but that the connection was undeniable. This is where modern forensic science changed the course of the investigation. A crime scene from decades earlier could now provide information that investigators in the past could not access. The advances in DNA analysis had transformed the way detectives approached unsolved murders. Cases once considered impossible were being reopened. Victims who had waited years for answers were finally being remembered. And criminals who believed they had escaped forever were discovering that time was not their ally. It was their enemy. Because every year that passed created more distance between the crime and the present. But it also created more opportunities for science to catch up. The person responsible for Celestina Perez's murder had lived through 31 years believing the past would remain buried. They had watched the case disappear from public attention. They had seen the world move forward. They may have believed that investigators had reached the end of the road. But they underestimated one thing: the determination to find justice. Cold case detectives often describe their work as unfinished conversations. The victim cannot speak. The family cannot move forward. The community cannot forget. So investigators become the voice that continues searching. For Celestina, that search continued long after many people thought the case had gone cold forever. The renewed investigation brought the possibility of an ending. But it also reopened old pain. For the people who loved Celestina, the possibility of justice came with complicated emotions. 31 years is a lifetime. People change. Families grow. The world moves forward. But grief does not follow a calendar. The loss remains. The questions remain. And the desire for accountability remains. An arrest would not bring Celestina back. It would not erase the years her family spent waiting. But it would provide something they had been denied for decades: the truth. As investigators gathered the evidence needed to move forward, the case reached a critical stage. The mystery that had survived 3 decades was beginning to collapse. The person who had remained hidden was no longer protected by uncertainty. The evidence was pointing in one direction. The investigation that had started with confusion was becoming a case built on facts. And after 31 years, the day arrived when the person accused of killing Celestina Perez was finally identified. The announcement sent shockwaves through the community. A case that had haunted Arizona for generations was no longer an unanswered question. There was finally a name. There was finally a suspect. There was finally a path toward justice. But even after the breakthrough, one question remained. How had this person managed to escape for so long? What happened during those missing years? And what evidence finally exposed the truth that had remained hidden since the day Celestina Perez was killed? The answers were buried within the investigation, within the evidence, within the decades of silence that had surrounded the case. And now, after years of waiting, the story was finally moving toward the courtroom. The cold case was no longer cold. The past had returned, and the person who believed they had escaped justice was about to face the consequences of a secret that had lasted 31 years. After 31 years of unanswered questions, the investigation into the murder of Celestina Perez finally reached the moment that everyone had been waiting for. The mystery had a name. The silence had been broken. The person who had remained beyond the reach of justice for more than 3 decades was no longer just a shadow in an old case file. Investigators had identified the individual they believed was responsible. For the Perez family, it was a moment filled with emotions that had been buried for years. Relief, pain, anger, and the overwhelming reality that the case they had carried for so long was finally moving forward. But for detectives, the identification of a suspect was only the beginning. A cold case can survive for decades because of one simple problem. Finding the person responsible is not the same as proving it. The courtroom does not operate on suspicion. It does not operate on theories. It demands evidence. A complete story. A connection between the crime and the accused that cannot be ignored. And after waiting 31 years, investigators knew they had one chance to present the truth. The case against the suspect had to be built carefully. Every piece of evidence mattered. Every timeline had to be examined. Every detail from the original investigation had to be compared with what modern forensic science had uncovered. The detectives working on Celestina's case understood the importance of patience. They were not simply trying to close a file. They were trying to deliver justice for a woman whose life had been taken decades earlier. The investigation became a journey backward through time. Back to the day Celestina disappeared. Back to the circumstances surrounding her death. Back to the unanswered questions that had haunted everyone connected to the case. Investigators reconstructed the events step by step. They examined what was known. They examined what had been uncertain. They searched for the moment when the truth had been hidden. Because every criminal leaves behind a story, even when they believe they have erased their tracks. Even when years pass. Even when witnesses forget. The evidence remains a silent witness. And in Celestina Perez's case, that evidence was finally speaking. The suspect had lived through more than 3 decades without facing consequences. For years, the investigation had stalled. But now, the same person who had escaped attention for so long was facing the reality that modern investigations had changed the rules. The passage of time was no longer a guarantee of safety. The world of forensic science had evolved. Technology that did not exist when the crime occurred was now capable of revealing connections that once seemed impossible. This was the new reality of cold case investigations. A crime committed decades ago could suddenly become a current investigation. A suspect who believed they were forgotten could suddenly become the center of attention. A family that had waited years could finally hear the words they had hoped for. An arrest had been made. Justice was moving closer. But behind every arrest in a cold case is a difficult emotional reality. The suspect is not the only person affected. For the victim's family, the arrest brings back memories of the original tragedy. It forces them to revisit the pain they have carried for decades. For 31 years, they had lived with the absence of answers. They had wondered if the person responsible would ever be found. They had wondered if Celestina's story would ever receive the ending it deserved. Now, that ending was beginning to take shape. The case also sent a message to the wider community. A murder does not become less important because time passes. A victim does not become forgotten because years go by. And justice does not have an expiration date. The arrest in Celestina Perez's case showed that even the oldest investigations can still produce answers. But as the legal process began, investigators faced the challenge of presenting a case that had been built across generations. The evidence had to explain what happened. It had to show the connection. It had to answer the questions that had remained unanswered for so long. How did Celestina's killer avoid detection? Why did the case remain unsolved for more than 3 decades? And what finally revealed the truth? Those questions became central as the prosecution prepared its case. The courtroom would become the place where decades of investigation came together, where old evidence and new technology would meet, where the story of Celestina Perez would finally be heard. For years, her name had been associated with uncertainty. Now it was becoming associated with justice. But even with an arrest, the emotional impact of the case remained. Because solving a murder does not erase the damage caused by it. It does not restore lost years. It does not return a loved one. It does not remove the memories of what happened. Justice cannot undo tragedy. But justice can acknowledge it. It can recognize the life that was lost. It can hold someone accountable. And after 31 years, that accountability was finally within reach. The investigation that began with a devastating discovery had traveled through decades of darkness. It had survived changing technology, changing investigators, and changing times. It had remained alive because someone refused to let Celestina Perez become just another forgotten name. Now, the focus shifted from investigation to prosecution. The evidence would be tested. The accusations would be examined. And the truth would finally face its greatest challenge. A courtroom. Because after more than 3 decades, the story that began with a woman's disappearance was about to reach its most important moment. The person accused of taking Celestina Perez's life would finally have to answer. And for the first time in 31 years, the world would hear the evidence that investigators believed revealed what truly happened. For more than 3 decades, the murder of Celestina Perez remained frozen in time. A crime that began with tragedy. An investigation that ended with uncertainty. And a family forced to wait for an answer that seemed further away with every passing year. But now, after 31 years, the silence surrounding the case had been broken. The person investigators believed responsible was finally facing justice. The arrest marked a turning point, but it also opened the door to the most important stage of the entire investigation. The search for the truth. Because an arrest does not end a murder case. It begins a battle over evidence, memory, and the events that led to a life being taken. For prosecutors, the challenge was enormous. They had to take a crime that happened decades earlier and explain it clearly. They had to bring together evidence collected long ago with discoveries made through modern forensic techniques. They had to show a jury that the passage of time had not destroyed the truth. Instead, it had preserved it. The courtroom became the place where the past and present collided. 31 years of unanswered questions were suddenly being examined under intense attention. Every detail mattered. Every piece of evidence carried the weight of decades. Every decision made during the original investigation was being revisited. The goal was simple: to tell the story of what happened to Celestina Perez, to show how her life ended, and to prove who was responsible. For the Perez family, watching the case move toward trial was a moment they had dreamed about but never knew if they would see. For years, they had lived with uncertainty. They had celebrated birthdays without Celestina. They had marked holidays without her presence. They had carried memories of a woman whose future had been taken away. Now, after decades of waiting, they were finally approaching the moment when they would hear the evidence presented publicly. But justice after 31 years comes with complicated emotions. Time changes everything. The people involved are older. The world is different. The pain, however, remains. A cold case does not only represent an unsolved crime. It represents years stolen from the people left behind. Years spent wondering. Years spent hoping. Years spent asking whether the truth would ever come. As prosecutors prepared their case, investigators continued examining every detail connected to the murder. They reviewed the original evidence. They studied forensic findings. They worked to create a timeline that explained the events surrounding Celestina's death. In a case this old, the timeline becomes one of the most important pieces of the puzzle. Because time can create uncertainty. It can create gaps. It can create questions. But investigators must fill those gaps with facts. They must show what happened before the crime, what happened during the crime, and what happened afterward. The evidence had to tell a complete story. A story that began with a woman whose life was suddenly interrupted, and ended with a person finally being held accountable. As the legal process continued, the case attracted renewed attention. A murder that had once faded from public memory was now back in the spotlight. People who had never heard Celestina's name were learning about her story. They were learning about a woman whose family had refused to stop searching for answers. They were learning about an investigation that survived because someone continued to believe justice was possible. The case also represented a larger shift in criminal investigations. For decades, many families believed that if a murder was not solved quickly, it might never be solved. But advances in science changed that belief. Cold cases across the country began experiencing breakthroughs. Evidence once considered limited became powerful. Old investigations were reopened. New questions were asked. And criminals who believed they had escaped forever discovered that the past could return at any moment. The murder of Celestina Perez became another example of this new reality. A case that had remained unsolved for a generation was now moving toward resolution. But behind the legal arguments and forensic evidence was a much deeper story. A story about a victim. A story about a family. A story about the determination to remember someone whose life mattered. Because every cold case has a danger. The longer a case remains unsolved, the easier it becomes for people to focus only on the mystery. The headlines. The investigation. The suspect. But at the center of everything was Celestina Perez, a woman who deserved to be remembered for who she was, not only for how she died. The renewed investigation gave her story a second chance. It brought attention back to the life that had been lost. It reminded people that behind every unsolved murder is a person whose absence changed the lives of others forever. As the case moved closer to trial, the questions that had haunted investigators for decades were finally being answered. The evidence was ready. The timeline was becoming clear. The mystery was slowly turning into a proven case. But one challenge remained. Could the prosecution convince the court that after 31 years, they had finally found the person responsible? Could they explain how the killer had avoided justice for so long? Could they provide the answers that Celestina's family had been waiting for? The courtroom would soon become the final battlefield. A place where evidence would be examined, where memories would be questioned, where the events of a long-forgotten crime would be brought back into the present. For 31 years, the person responsible had lived with the belief that the passage of time had protected them. But now, the past was standing in front of them. The evidence. The investigation. The memory of Celestina Perez. Everything had returned. And after decades of waiting, the final chapter of one of Arizona's most haunting cold cases was about to begin. After 31 years of silence, the murder of Celestina Perez had finally reached a moment that seemed impossible for generations. The case that once appeared destined to remain unsolved was now standing before the justice system. A suspect had been identified. Evidence had been gathered. And the questions that had haunted a family for decades were finally being brought into the light. But the courtroom would not be about time. It would not be about rumors. It would not be about emotions alone. It would be about evidence. Evidence that could prove what happened. Evidence that could reveal the truth. Evidence that could finally explain how a woman's life was taken and why the person responsible had escaped accountability for so many years. For prosecutors, the challenge was unlike any ordinary homicide case. They were not presenting a crime that happened recently. They were presenting a crime separated from the present by more than 3 decades. A crime from another era. A crime investigated with different technology. A crime surrounded by years of unanswered questions. Every detail had to be carefully explained. The jury needed to understand not only what investigators discovered, but why those discoveries mattered. They needed to understand how evidence preserved from the past could still reveal the truth today. This was the power of modern forensic science. Time could weaken memories. Time could change circumstances. But physical evidence could remain. A trace left behind decades earlier could still connect a person to a crime. A detail overlooked in the past could become the key to solving the mystery. And that was exactly what investigators had discovered. The evidence connected to Celestina Perez's murder had waited for the right moment. For years, it had remained silent. But advances in forensic analysis allowed investigators to examine it in ways that were impossible when the crime first occurred. The investigation became a bridge between two different worlds. The world of the original detectives who first searched for answers, and the world of modern investigators who finally had the tools to uncover them. The courtroom became the place where those two worlds came together. Jurors heard about the history of the case. They learned about the years of uncertainty. They learned about the persistence required to reopen an investigation that had remained unresolved for so long. And they learned about the evidence that investigators believed connected the accused to the murder. For Celestina's family, hearing the details of the case again meant reopening painful memories. Decades may have passed, but the loss remained. A daughter, a family member, a person whose life should have continued. The trial was not only about proving guilt. It was about acknowledging the impact of the crime. It was about recognizing that Celestina Perez was not just a victim in a file. She was someone who mattered. Someone who was loved. Someone whose absence left a permanent mark. As the prosecution presented its case, the story of the investigation unfolded piece by piece. Detectives described the challenges of revisiting an old crime. They explained how evidence that once seemed limited became significant years later. They showed how patience and persistence eventually led investigators back to the person they believed responsible. The defense, however, faced the difficult task of challenging a case built over 31 years. When a crime is decades old, questions naturally arise. Could memories be trusted? Could evidence collected long ago still be reliable? Could investigators accurately reconstruct events after so much time had passed? These questions became central to the legal battle. Because in every criminal trial, the accused has the right to challenge the evidence. The responsibility of the prosecution was to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. Not simply to suggest what happened, but to demonstrate it. The courtroom became a place where every piece of information was examined. Every assumption was questioned. Every connection was tested. The story that had remained incomplete for decades was now being carefully rebuilt. And as the trial continued, one fact became impossible to ignore. The case had survived because people refused to give up. Investigators refused to forget. Families refused to stop asking questions. And evidence refused to disappear. The murder of Celestina Perez became a powerful reminder that cold cases are never truly closed when justice has not been served. They remain unfinished, waiting, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, waiting for the moment when technology, determination, and investigation finally come together. For the people who worked on the case, the pursuit of justice was not simply about solving a crime. It was about correcting a wrong. A woman had lost her life. A family had lost someone they loved. And for too long, the person responsible had avoided consequences. The trial represented the final stage of a journey that began 31 years earlier. A journey filled with unanswered questions, investigative setbacks, and moments when the possibility of resolution seemed impossible. But now, the truth was being examined in public. The evidence was no longer hidden in old files. The investigation was no longer limited to private discussions. The story of Celestina Perez was finally being heard. And as the trial moved forward, the central question remained the same one that had followed the case from the beginning. Was this the person who had taken Celestina's life? Could the evidence finally prove what investigators had believed for so long? For decades, the killer had lived with the assumption that time had created distance between the crime and justice. But the courtroom proved something different. Time had not erased the crime. Time had not erased the evidence. And time had not erased Celestina Perez's name. Her story had survived, Her family's search had survived. And now, after 31 years, the final decision would determine whether justice would finally arrive. The case that had begun with a devastating loss was approaching its final confrontation. The evidence had been presented. The questions had been asked. The past had been brought back to life. And soon, a verdict would decide the fate of the person accused of ending Celestina Perez's life and carrying a secret for more than 3 decades. After more than 3 decades of unanswered questions, the murder of Celestina Perez had reached the moment that everyone connected to the case had been waiting for. A courtroom. A verdict. A final judgment on a mystery that had haunted a family and a community for 31 years. For decades, Celestina's name had represented uncertainty. A woman whose life ended violently. A family left searching for answers. An investigation that seemed trapped in the past. But now, the story was no longer only about what had been lost. It was about accountability. The trial brought together everything that had defined the investigation. The original tragedy. The years of searching. The advances in science. And the determination of investigators who refused to let the case disappear. For the jury, the responsibility was enormous. They were not simply deciding the outcome of a criminal case. They were examining decades of evidence and trying to reconstruct events from a time long before the trial began. They had to determine whether the evidence presented truly connected the accused to the murder of Celestina Perez. Every detail mattered. Every piece of testimony mattered. Every piece of forensic evidence mattered. Because after 31 years, the truth depended on the strength of what investigators had uncovered. The prosecution presented the case as a story of persistence. A story showing that while the crime had remained unsolved for decades, it had never truly been forgotten. Investigators explained how the case had evolved over time. How evidence that once provided limited information gained new importance as technology advanced. How modern forensic methods allowed detectives to revisit questions that had remained unanswered for generations. The message was clear. The passage of time did not destroy the truth. It only delayed its discovery. But the defense challenged the prosecution's conclusions. After 31 years, memories could change. Details could become unclear. Questions could remain about events that happened decades earlier. The defense argued that the passage of time itself created uncertainty. And in any criminal trial, uncertainty is critical. Because the burden of proof belongs entirely to the prosecution. They had to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. They had to show that the evidence did not simply suggest an answer. It proved one. The courtroom became a place where the past was examined under intense pressure. Old evidence was analyzed. Previous assumptions were questioned. The events surrounding Celestina's final moments were reconstructed. The jury was asked to look beyond the years that had passed and focus on the facts that remained. For Celestina's family, the trial represented a moment they had waited for since the day their lives changed forever. But it was also a painful reminder of everything they had lost. 31 years is a long time. Children become adults. Families grow. The world changes. But grief can remain frozen around the moment a loved one is taken away. The trial could not return Celestina to them. No verdict could restore the years they had spent without her. But justice could provide something that had been missing. Recognition. Acknowledgement. The confirmation that what happened to Celestina mattered. As the proceedings continued, the details of the investigation showed the extraordinary challenge of solving a murder after so many years. Cold case investigations require patience because every step is more difficult. Witnesses may no longer be available. Memories may have faded. Records may be incomplete. But investigators working on Celestina's case had something powerful on their side. Evidence. The evidence had survived. And after decades of silence, it helped tell the story that could no longer be told by Celestina herself. That is what makes cold cases so unique. The victim cannot explain what happened. The victim cannot identify the person responsible. The victim cannot defend their own memory. Investigators must speak for them. They must follow the clues left behind. They must piece together the final moments of a life that ended too soon. And in Celestina Perez's case, that search continued until the truth finally reached the courtroom. As closing arguments approached, both sides attempted to leave the jury with a final impression. The prosecution emphasized the years of investigation and the significance of the evidence. They argued that the case represented the result of decades of determination. The defense focused on questions and uncertainty. They reminded jurors that the case was built around events from the distant past. The decision now belonged to the jury, a decision that would determine whether the person accused of killing Celestina Perez would finally be held accountable. For the community that had followed the case, the moment carried enormous emotional weight. A mystery that had existed for an entire generation was approaching its conclusion. The headlines that once announced an unsolved murder were now preparing to announce something different. Justice, or the possibility that another question would remain unanswered. But one thing was already clear. Celestina Perez had not been forgotten. Her name had survived 31 years of silence. Her story had survived the passage of time. And the people searching for answers had proven something important. A case may grow cold, but the need for justice does not. As the jury prepared to deliberate, the atmosphere surrounding the case changed. The investigation was over. The evidence had been presented. The arguments had been made. Now came the moment that would determine the final chapter. After 31 years, the question that had followed Celestina Perez's family through decades of uncertainty was finally waiting for an answer. Who was responsible? And would justice finally come for a woman whose story had remained unfinished for far too long? The courtroom became silent. The evidence had spoken. The jury had the responsibility. And after 3 decades of waiting, the world was about to learn whether the mystery of Celestina Perez's murder would finally come to an end. After 31 years of uncertainty, the moment that Celestina Perez's family had waited for had finally arrived. The jury had heard the evidence. They had listened to the testimony. They had examined the investigation that had stretched across generations. Now, they faced the responsibility of deciding whether the person accused of killing Celestina Perez would finally be held accountable. For decades, the case had existed in a painful space between memory and mystery. There had been no verdict, no final answer, no official conclusion. Only a family left wondering and a community left remembering. But now, the silence that surrounded the case was about to be broken. The jury's decision would not change what happened to Celestina. It would not bring back the years that had been taken away. It would not erase the suffering her family had carried since the day she was killed. But it would answer one of the most important questions in any murder investigation. Would the person responsible finally face justice? Inside the courtroom, every detail of the case carried the weight of more than 3 decades. The evidence represented years of work. The testimony represented memories that had survived through time. The investigation represented the determination of people who refused to accept that Celestina's murder would remain forever unanswered. Cold cases are often defined by uncertainty, but they are also defined by endurance. They are reminders that justice can move slowly, but it does not always disappear. The investigation into Celestina Perez's death showed how much criminal investigations had changed. When the crime first occurred, detectives worked with the tools available at the time. They followed leads. They collected evidence. They searched for answers. But some mysteries cannot be solved until the future catches up with the past. Years later, new forensic methods gave investigators another opportunity. Evidence that once seemed unable to provide answers became the foundation of a new investigation. Technology became the bridge between the crime scene of the past and the courtroom of the present. And that bridge had brought the case to this final moment. The jury carefully considered the arguments from both sides. The prosecution had presented the case as a story of persistence and scientific discovery. They argued that the evidence connected the accused to the murder and that the investigation had finally uncovered the truth hidden for 31 years. The defense questioned the reliability of a case built over such a long period of time. They challenged the interpretation of evidence. They raised questions about the passage of years and the difficulty of reconstructing events from the distant past. The jury had to weigh everything. Not emotion, not speculation, but evidence. That is the difficult responsibility of justice. A courtroom is not a place where the pain of a family alone determines the outcome. It is a place where facts must be examined carefully, where accusations must be proven, where the truth must survive questioning. For Celestina's loved ones, waiting for the verdict was another painful chapter in a journey that had already lasted far too long. They had spent years wondering if this day would ever come. They had lived with the uncertainty of knowing that someone responsible for Celestina's death had never answered for it. Now, that uncertainty was finally coming to an end. The verdict carried the weight of history. A decision in a case that had lasted longer than many people involved had imagined. A decision that represented more than just a courtroom outcome. It represented the end of a search. The end of a question that had followed the Perez family for 31 years. When the verdict was finally delivered, it marked the conclusion of one of Arizona's most haunting cold cases. The person accused of murdering Celestina Perez was held accountable. The investigation that had once reached a dead end had finally reached its destination. Justice had arrived. But even after the legal process ended, the story of Celestina Perez remained much larger than a conviction. Because behind every cold case is a human story. A person who was loved. A life that mattered. A family forever changed. The conclusion of the case did not erase the tragedy. It did not undo the pain, but it restored something that had been missing for decades. A sense that Celestina's life and her death had not been forgotten. Her name was no longer only connected to an unsolved mystery. It became connected to perseverance, to the determination of investigators, to the belief that even the oldest cases deserve answers. The resolution also sent a message to other families living with similar uncertainty. A case that appears impossible today may not be impossible forever. The tools available to investigators continue to evolve. Evidence continues to wait. And sometimes, the smallest overlooked detail can become the discovery that changes everything. For 31 years, the person responsible for Celestina Perez's death lived with the belief that the past had disappeared. But the past had not disappeared. It had been waiting. Waiting for technology. Waiting for investigators. Waiting for justice. The murder of Celestina Perez became another example of how time can transform a cold case. What once seemed like an unsolvable mystery became a reminder that accountability can survive decades of silence. The investigation proved that victims are not forgotten simply because years pass. Their stories remain. Their families continue searching. And the pursuit of justice continues long after the headlines disappear. For Celestina Perez, the long journey had finally reached its conclusion. A case that began with loss ended with answers. A mystery that lasted 31 years finally had a resolution. But the impact of her story would continue. Because every cold case leaves behind more than evidence. It leaves behind memories. It leaves behind lessons. And it leaves behind a reminder that no matter how much time passes, the truth can still find its way home. The question that once haunted Arizona had finally been answered. The killer who believed the years would protect them had finally been exposed. And after 3 decades of waiting, Celestina Perez finally received the justice her family had fought so hard to find. For 31 years, the murder of Celestina Perez remained a painful reminder of one of the hardest realities in criminal investigations. Some cases do not end when the investigation begins. Some cases do not end when the evidence is collected. Some cases remain open in the hearts of families who continue waiting for the truth. Celestina Perez's story was one of those cases. A story that began with tragedy. A story that survived decades of uncertainty. A story that proved that even the passage of time cannot erase the search for justice. The final resolution brought an answer to a question that had remained unanswered for more than 3 decades. Who was responsible for taking Celestina's life? After years of investigation, advances in forensic science, and the determination of law enforcement, the person accused of committing the crime was finally brought before the justice system. For Celestina's family, the outcome represented something they had spent years hoping to see. Accountability. But justice, after decades of waiting, carries a complicated emotion. Because even when a case is solved, the loss remains. A courtroom decision cannot restore the moments that were taken away. It cannot return birthdays that passed without Celestina. It cannot replace the conversations that never happened. It cannot undo the pain carried by the people who loved her. But it can provide something important. It can confirm that her life mattered. It can confirm that her story was worth fighting for. It can confirm that a victim is never just a forgotten name in an old investigation file. Celestina Perez was a person. She had dreams. She had memories. She had people who cared about her. And after decades of silence, her story was finally heard again. The investigation into her murder became a powerful example of how cold cases can transform over time. When the crime first occurred, investigators worked with the tools available to them. They followed every lead they could find. They collected evidence. They search for answers. But sometimes, the technology of one generation is not enough to solve the mysteries left behind by another. Years later, science advanced. Investigative methods improved. And evidence that once seemed impossible to use became the key to unlocking the truth. That is the reality of modern cold case investigations. The past is never truly gone. A forgotten piece of evidence can become important again. A case that appears finished can suddenly return to life. A person who believes they have escaped justice can discover that time was never their protection. Time was only the distance between the crime and the moment the truth was revealed. The murder of Celestina Perez also left a lasting message for investigators and families across the country. Cold cases require patience. They require dedication. They require people willing to continue searching even when answers seem impossible. Because behind every file number is a person. Behind every piece of evidence is a story. Behind every unanswered question is a family waiting. For decades, Celestina's family carried that uncertainty. They carried the pain of not knowing. They carried the frustration of seeing years pass without justice. But they also carried something else. The belief that her story deserved an ending. That belief kept the search alive. And eventually it led to the truth. The resolution of the case did not erase the years of waiting. But it changed the meaning of those years. They were no longer only years of uncertainty. They became years of persistence. Years of refusing to forget. Years that showed the power of determination. For the investigators who worked on the case, the conclusion represented more than solving a crime. It represented fulfilling a responsibility. The responsibility to speak for someone who could no longer speak for herself. The responsibility to continue searching when others might have given up. The responsibility to show that justice does not disappear simply because time passes. The story of Celestina Perez became part of a larger conversation about cold cases throughout America. Thousands of families continue waiting for answers. Thousands of investigations remain unresolved. But every solved case brings hope. Every breakthrough proves that an unanswered mystery today does not mean an unanswered mystery forever. Science continues to evolve. Investigators continue learning. Evidence continues waiting. And sometimes, decades later, the truth finally emerges. The murder of Celestina Perez began as a devastating tragedy. For years, it was defined by silence. But it ended as a reminder of something much more powerful. The truth can survive. Justice can survive. Memory can survive. 31 years could not erase Celestina's name. 31 years could not erase the questions. And 31 years could not erase the determination of those who wanted justice. The final chapter of the case brought closure to one investigation. But it also preserved a warning. A warning to those who believe time can hide wrongdoing forever. A warning that evidence can wait. A warning that the past can return. A warning that no matter how many years pass, accountability remains possible. Because every crime leaves behind a story. Every victim leaves behind a legacy. And every cold case carries the possibility of one day being solved. For Celestina Perez, that day finally came. The mystery that haunted Arizona for more than 3 decades was no longer a mystery. The question that remained unanswered for generations finally had an answer. And the woman whose life was taken was finally remembered not only as the victim of a terrible crime, but as someone whose story mattered enough for people to keep searching. After 31 years, the silence ended. The investigation was complete. The truth was revealed. And justice finally arrived for Celestina Perez. The courtroom eventually emptied. The voices that had argued over evidence grew quiet. The stacks of exhibits were packed away. Reporters who had followed the case filed their final stories. Cameras disappeared. Microphones were switched off. Another trial had ended. Another verdict had entered the public record, and another chapter in Arizona's criminal justice history had finally closed. But for the people who had carried Celestina Perez's memory through 31 long years, there was no dramatic moment when everything suddenly felt normal again. Justice can close a case. It cannot erase an absence. There is a common misunderstanding about solved murders. Many imagine that once an arrest is made, once a verdict is reached, grief simply disappears, as though decades of unanswered questions can be replaced overnight by a single answer. As though a courtroom has the power to restore birthdays that were missed, family photographs that were never taken, conversations that never happened, or futures that were stolen forever. Real life does not work that way. Justice is not a time machine. It cannot return a daughter. It cannot return a sister. It cannot return a mother. It cannot give back the ordinary moments that disappeared with one act of violence. What it can do is something equally important. It can restore truth. For years, Celestina Perez's family lived under the shadow of uncertainty. Uncertainty creates its own kind of suffering. Every unanswered question becomes another burden. Every passing anniversary becomes another reminder that somewhere, someone knew exactly what had happened while those left behind continued searching for answers. The truth ends that uncertainty. Pain remains. Loss remains. But doubt finally comes to an end. That distinction matters more than many people realize. Families of homicide victims often describe uncertainty as a prison with no walls. They know someone they love is gone, yet they cannot fully move forward because the story remains unfinished. Every new rumor reopens old wounds. Every false lead creates another cycle of hope followed by disappointment. A solved case cannot undo those years. but it allows history to be written with facts instead of questions. For investigators, the conclusion of the Perez case represented something equally profound. Every detective who works cold cases understands that success is measured differently than in ordinary investigations. There are no fresh crime scenes. There are no immediate witnesses. There are no frantic searches conducted within hours of the crime. Instead, investigators inherit silence. Boxes filled with aging reports. Evidence preserved for decades. Photographs whose colors have faded. Interview notes written by detectives who may have long since retired or passed away. Every cold case investigator accepts an unusual responsibility. They are asked to finish someone else's work. They step into investigations begun by another generation. They attempt to hear voices that have been silent for decades. And sometimes they succeed because they refuse to believe that the age of a crime determines its value. The murder of Celestina Perez reminded investigators across the country that justice has no expiration date. It also demonstrated something remarkable about modern forensic science. Technology did not replace detective work. It strengthened it. Evidence does not solve crimes by itself. People solve crimes. Scientists preserve biological evidence with extraordinary precision. Laboratory analysts interpret complex forensic results. Detectives compare timelines, verify statements, challenge assumptions, and connect relationships. Prosecutors evaluate whether those discoveries can withstand the demands of a courtroom. Justice is never the result of one breakthrough. It is built from hundreds of careful decisions made by people who refuse to stop asking difficult questions. That lesson extends far beyond Arizona. Across the United States, thousands of homicide investigations remain unsolved. Each represents a family waiting. Each represents evidence still capable of revealing something new. Each represents a promise that has not yet been fulfilled. Some of those investigations may never reach a courtroom. Others may suddenly change because of one scientific advancement, one overlooked document, one preserved sample, or one investigator willing to review an old file from the beginning. That possibility is what keeps cold case units alive. Hope is not an investigative strategy. Persistence is. The story of Celestina Perez also serves as a warning to those who believe that time protects criminals. For generations, many offenders relied upon the limitations of the era in which they committed their crimes. They understood how difficult investigations once were. They understood that forensic science had boundaries. They assumed those boundaries would remain forever. History has proven otherwise. Every decade expands the ability of investigators to recover, preserve, and interpret evidence. Every improvement narrows the space where secrets can survive. Every solved cold case sends a message heard far beyond a single courtroom. The calendar is not your accomplice. Years are not your shield. Silence is not the same as innocence. Perhaps that is why stories like Celestina Perez's continue capturing public attention long after the verdict. People are naturally drawn toward mysteries, but they stay because of something deeper. They stay because every cold case asks uncomfortable questions about memory, justice, and responsibility. Who remembers the forgotten? Who continues searching after everyone else has moved on? Who speaks for victims who can no longer speak for themselves? Those questions have no simple answers, but they deserve to be asked. As years become decades, public attention inevitably shifts elsewhere. New crimes dominate headlines. New tragedies occupy television screens. Yesterday's breaking news becomes today's forgotten archive. Families rarely have that luxury. Their calendar never truly resets. Every holiday includes an empty chair. Every celebration carries a missing voice. Every milestone becomes a reminder of someone who should have been there. That reality exists beyond every statistic about unsolved homicide. Behind every case number is a human life. Behind every investigative report is someone whose absence permanently altered the people left behind. Celestina Perez was one of those people. Her name eventually became associated with a remarkable cold case investigation. But before she became evidence, headlines, or courtroom testimony, she was simply a woman living her life. That is perhaps the most important part of her story. Victims deserve to be remembered as people before they are remembered as cases. The resolution of her murder restored more than accountability. It restored identity. It reminded the public that this was never merely an investigation. It was always about a human being. As the final pages of the investigative file were completed, another chapter quietly began. The chapter of remembrance. Unlike investigations, remembrance has no closing date. It belongs to families, to communities, to history, and to every person willing to learn from the past. The murder of Celestina Perez can no longer be described as an unsolved mystery. The question that haunted Arizona for more than 3 decades has finally been answered through the justice system. Yet its legacy extends far beyond one conviction. It lives inside every detective who opens another aging file, every forensic scientist examining decades-old evidence, every prosecutor preparing a case many believed impossible, every family refusing to surrender hope. Because every solved cold case carries the same quiet promise. Someone cared enough to continue searching. Someone refused to let time become the final verdict. Someone believed the truth was still waiting. For 31 years, the silence surrounding Celestina Perez seemed almost permanent. In the end, silence lost. The evidence endured. The investigation endured. Her family's determination endured. And perhaps that is the most powerful ending any cold case can offer. Not simply that justice finally arrived, but that memory proved stronger than time itself. Long after the courtroom doors closed, long after the headlines faded once again, one truth remained. Celestina Perez was never forgotten. And because she was never forgotten, the search never truly ended until the truth finally caught up with the past. At 11:47 p.m., the final call came through. It lasted exactly 18 seconds. No words. No desperate screams. No plea for help. Only shallow breathing, a metallic scraping sound somewhere in the background, and what investigators would later describe as 3 slow knocks, evenly spaced, as though someone or something was striking wood. Then the line went dead. By sunrise, 28-year-old Emily Carter had vanished without leaving behind a single confirmed trace. For the next 20 years, detectives would chase rumors across 3 states, interview more than 200 witnesses, excavate abandoned farmland, drain a forgotten quarry, and reopen the investigation 6 separate times. Nothing. No body. No confession. No ransom demand. No verifo sighting. Only an unanswered phone call that would become one of the most analyzed pieces of evidence in modern criminal history. Until an old brass key, hidden inside the wall of a condemned farmhouse nearly 2 decades later, forced everyone to look in a direction no one had ever imagined. This is the story of how an ordinary Friday night became a nightmare that refused to end. Blackridge wasn't the kind of town where people disappeared. With fewer than 12,000 residents, everyone knew everyone else's routines. The waitress at the diner already knew what customers would order before they sat down. The mechanic left keys inside unlocked trucks because nobody expected theft. Children rode bicycles until sunset without parents worrying about whether they would come home. It wasn't paradise, but it was predictable. People trusted that tomorrow would look almost exactly like today. That illusion shattered on October 14th. Emily Carter had worked the late shift at Hawthorne Medical Supply for nearly 3 years. The warehouse wasn't glamorous. It supplied hospitals with surgical equipment, disposable medical kits, and laboratory materials across northern Arizona. The work was repetitive. Long aisles, concrete floors, barcode scanners, pallet jacks humming beneath fluorescent lights. Emily never complained. Co-workers described her as dependable. Always early. Always organized. Always willing to stay an extra hour if another employee called in sick. She lived alone in a small rental house, less than 15 minutes from work. Every Friday followed almost the same pattern. Clock out. Stop for coffee at an all-night convenience store. Drive home. Call her younger sister before midnight. Watch whatever old movie happened to be playing on cable. Go to bed. Saturday mornings belonged to laundry, grocery shopping, and long phone conversations with her mother. She liked routines. They made life easier. That's why October 14th should have been completely forgettable. Security cameras captured Emily leaving the warehouse at exactly 11:31 p.m. She waved goodbye to the security guard. He waved back. Nothing seemed unusual. She carried the same brown shoulder bag she always brought to work. Her employee badge still hung around her neck. She climbed into her silver sedan. The parking lot camera watched her headlights disappear beyond the entrance. It was the last verified image of Emily Carter ever recorded. At first, nobody panicked. Her sister assumed Emily had simply gone to bed early. When repeated phone calls went unanswered Saturday morning, concern slowly replaced annoyance. By Saturday afternoon, concern became fear. Emily never ignored family. Never. She missed birthdays exactly once because of a severe flu. She apologized for weeks afterward. Ignoring her mother's calls? Impossible. Her car wasn't parked outside her house. The front door remained locked. Inside, everything looked untouched. The television was off. Laundry from earlier in the week still sat folded on the couch. A grocery list remained attached to the refrigerator with a sunflower magnet. Milk, eggs, coffee filters, cat food. The cat was inside. Hungry. Alone. Her purse wasn't in the house. Neither were her car keys. Nothing suggested she had packed for a trip. Nothing suggested she intended to disappear voluntarily. Police officially opened a missing person investigation before sunset. Initially, detectives believed the explanation would be simple. Mechanical trouble. An accident on a rural road. Maybe she'd become stranded somewhere without cell phone service. Search teams checked highways, back roads, dry riverbeds, nearby forests. Volunteer firefighters searched drainage ditches. Helicopters flew overhead. Tracking dogs followed Emily's scent from the warehouse parking lot to a nearby intersection. Then the scent vanished. Completely. As though she had climbed into another vehicle. Or had never continued driving beyond that point at all. The discovery changed everything. Detectives examined traffic cameras from neighboring intersections. Most cameras recorded over their footage every 72 hours. By the time investigators requested the recordings, nearly all of them were gone. Only one grainy camera from an abandoned gas station still held usable images. The quality was terrible. Blurry. Monochrome. Barely recognizable. Still, investigators watched it frame by frame. At 11:38 p.m., Emily's sedan entered the intersection. It slowed. Stopped. Then remained motionless for nearly 20 seconds despite having a green light. No pedestrians crossed. No visible obstacle blocked the road. Then another vehicle entered the frame behind her. Dark-colored. Possibly an SUV. Its headlights made identifying details impossible. Emily's car accelerated. The SUV followed. Both disappeared from view. Neither vehicle appeared on any camera beyond that location. It was as though the night itself had swallowed them. 3 days later, a rancher discovered Emily's car. It sat abandoned behind an old grain elevator almost 20 miles outside town. The location made no sense. Emily had no reason to be there. The engine was cold. Doors locked. Windows closed. Nothing appeared stolen. Her shoulder bag rested on the passenger seat. Wallet untouched. Cash still inside. Phone missing. Detectives immediately sealed the area. Forensic teams examined every inch of the vehicle. Fingerprints. Fibers. Hair. Tire tracks. Footwear impressions. There were fingerprints everywhere. Emily's. Co-workers. Mechanics who had serviced the car months earlier. Nothing unexpected. No obvious sign of violence. No blood. No broken glass. No straggle. One detail, however, unsettled investigators. The driver's seat had been adjusted significantly farther back than Emily normally kept it. Emily stood barely 5'4". Whoever last drove that vehicle appeared considerably taller. But there was no way to prove exactly when the seat had been moved. It could have happened that night. Or weeks earlier. Another possibility joined the growing list of unanswered questions. The car itself held almost no clues. The surrounding ground told an equally frustrating story. Heavy rain had fallen the previous evening. Any usable footprints had dissolved into mud before investigators arrived. Tire impressions overlapped repeatedly because farm equipment routinely used the area. Whatever evidence once existed had disappeared beneath weather and time. The investigation expanded rapidly. Emily's co-workers were interviewed. Family members. Former classmates. Neighbors. Old boyfriends. Customers from the convenience store she usually visited after work. Everyone described essentially the same woman. Responsible. Independent. Friendly without being outgoing. No known enemies. No financial troubles. No obvious reason to vanish. Then detectives discovered something strange. Emily never stopped for coffee that night. The clerk at the convenience store remembered because every Friday she ordered the exact same thing. Large black coffee. 1 blueberry muffin. Always paid with exact change. Always smiled before leaving. October 14th was the first Friday in nearly 3 years she never walked through the door. Meaning whatever happened almost immediately after leaving work. Investigators reconstructed the route again. Warehouse. Intersection. Unknown SUV. Abandoned grain elevator. Missing woman. Every answer seemed to produce 2 new questions. Then, on the 5th day of the investigation, the police department's evidence hotline received a voicemail. Timestamp. 11:47 p.m. Exactly 16 minutes after Emily left work. The recording lasted 18 seconds. At first, dispatch believed it was accidental. Until audio technicians enhanced the file. No voice. Only breathing. Metal scraping. Then, knock. 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 Slow. Measured. Perfectly spaced. The sound became infamous. Experts disagreed about its origin. Wood. Metal. Concrete. No one could identify it. The call had been placed from Emily's cell phone. Cell tower records placed the signal somewhere within a 5-mile radius west of Blackridge. An area containing thousands of acres of abandoned farmland, dry creek beds, shuttered barns, forgotten wells, and empty houses slowly being reclaimed by the desert. Search teams spent weeks combing the landscape. Nothing. No phone. No clothing. No body. No witness. Only silence. And as October turned into November, investigators began confronting a possibility they desperately wanted to avoid. Emily Carter had not simply disappeared. Someone had made sure she could never find her way home. They just didn't know who. Or why. And somewhere beyond the empty fields west of Blackridge, hidden beneath 20 years of dust and forgotten memories, the first real answer was already waiting, locked behind a rusted door that no one had opened in decades. By the second week, the search had become something else entirely. Hope was no longer driving the operation. Routine was. Every morning before sunrise, deputies gathered around folding tables covered with maps. Volunteers arrived carrying flashlights, bottled water, and hiking boots coated in the dust of yesterday's search. Helicopters lifted off as the first orange light crept over the Arizona horizon. Mounted patrols moved through dry washes. Search dogs worked fence lines, abandoned wells, and forgotten ranch roads that hadn't seen regular traffic in years. Every evening they returned with the same report. Nothing. No clothing. No cell phone. No body. No explanation. Blackridge had never experienced a disappearance like this. Parents who once let children ride bicycles until dark suddenly called them home before sunset. Front doors that had remained unlocked for decades were fitted with deadbolts. Porch lights stayed on throughout the night. Local hardware stores sold out of security cameras within days. People stopped talking about football. Stopped talking about weather. Stopped talking about politics. Every conversation eventually returned to Emily Carter. Did they find anything today? Oh. Any suspects? Not yet. What about that SUV? No one knows where it went. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some claimed Emily had witnessed a drug deal. Others insisted she'd uncovered financial fraud at the medical warehouse. One story suggested she'd secretly planned to leave town with a married man. Another claimed she'd been seen boarding a bus in Nevada. Every rumor collapsed under investigation. Every theory led nowhere. Detective Nathan Briggs hated rumors. A 22-year veteran of the Blackridge Sheriff's Office, Briggs had built a reputation for patience rather than speed. He rarely spoke during interviews, preferring long silences that made witnesses uncomfortable enough to keep talking. He had solved difficult cases before. Domestic murders disguised as accidents. Insurance fraud schemes stretching across county lines. A serial arsonist who turned out to be a volunteer firefighter. But Emily Carter's disappearance felt different. There was no center to it. Every clue dissolved the moment investigators reached for it. Briggs pinned a large county map across one wall of the incident room. Colored pins covered it within days. Red for confirmed sightings. Blue for witness interviews. Yellow for evidence recovered. Green for search zones already cleared. The pattern should have revealed something. Instead, it looked like someone had emptied a box of colored needles onto random pieces of desert. There was no logic. No direction. Just chaos. The anonymous phone call bothered him more than anything else. The recording had been enhanced repeatedly by audio specialists. Breathing. Metal scraping. 3 slow knocks. Nothing more. The caller never spoke. The silence itself felt deliberate. Investigators sent copies of the recording to specialists across the country. Mechanical engineers. Construction experts. Musicians. Railroad workers. Shipbuilders. Anyone who might recognize the unusual rhythm or identify the metallic sound. Weeks later, responses began arriving. One expert believed it sounded like a heavy chain dragged across steel. Another suggested an old barn door. Someone else thought it resembled a loose elevator cable. None could agree. The recording became another mystery attached to the case. Then came the first real witness, or so everyone believed. An elderly truck driver walked into the sheriff's office nearly 3 weeks after Emily disappeared. He claimed that around midnight on October 14th, he'd stopped near mile marker 62 to check a loose trailer strap. As he climbed back into his truck, he noticed a silver sedan parked beside an abandoned irrigation canal. A dark SUV sat directly behind it. He couldn't see faces, only silhouettes. 2 people appeared to be standing outside the vehicles. He assumed it was a couple arguing. He drove away. The location matched the general area where Emily's cell phone signal had last connected. For 48 hours, investigators believed the case had finally turned. Search teams flooded the canal. Divers entered murky water despite poor visibility. Ground-penetrating radar scanned nearby fields. Cadaver dogs searched abandoned structures within a 5-mile radius. Nothing. The witness remained credible. The evidence did not. Detective Briggs returned to Emily's house. Sometimes answers weren't hidden in complicated forensic reports. Sometimes they sat inside ordinary lives. Emily's home looked exactly as it had on the first day. Books neatly arranged. Coffee mugs washed and stacked. A calendar hanging beside the refrigerator. Birthdays circled in blue ink. Work shifts marked carefully in black. Nothing unusual until Briggs noticed one date. October 18th. 4 days after Emily disappeared. Instead of a reminder or appointment, she'd written only 2 words. Return key. No explanation. No address. No name. Just those 2 words. At first glance, it seemed insignificant. People borrowed keys all the time. Neighbors. Co-workers. Storage units. Gym lockers. Yet nobody knew what key Emily intended to return. Her family didn't. Friends didn't. Co-workers didn't. Even the landlord couldn't identify anything missing. Detectives searched the house again. They cataloged every key they found. House key. Car spare. Mailbox. Storage cabinet at work. Nothing matched the mysterious reminder. Another question joined the investigation. Return which key? Briggs circled the words on a photocopy of the calendar. Sometimes the smallest note became the biggest clue. Other times, it meant absolutely nothing. The weeks turned into months. National media arrived. Satellite trucks lined Main Street. Television anchors stood outside the sheriff's office delivering dramatic updates every evening. Another day without answers. The mystery deepens. Where is Emily Carter? Pressure mounted. County officials demanded progress. State investigators offered assistance. The FBI reviewed portions of the case. Behavioral analysts examined timelines. Criminal profilers suggested possibilities ranging from organized abduction to opportunistic violence. Every opinion sounded convincing. None produced evidence. Then winter arrived. Search operations slowed. Desert nights became bitterly cold. Volunteer numbers dropped. Media attention shifted toward newer tragedies. The cameras disappeared almost as quickly as they had arrived. Blackridge returned to something resembling normal life. Only it wasn't normal anymore. Emily's photograph remained taped inside shop windows. Her missing person poster faded beneath sunlight. Rain curled its edges. People stopped asking whether she'd be found. Instead, they began asking something much darker. Had she already been found? Just not by the police? Exactly 6 months after the disappearance, another discovery shook the investigation. Maintenance workers replacing utility poles outside town uncovered Emily's cell phone. Or what remained of it. The device had been crushed repeatedly, its screen shattered, battery removed, SIM card missing. Someone had intentionally destroyed it. Forensic technicians spent weeks recovering damaged components. Most information was unrecoverable. Call logs had been erased, messages corrupted, photos permanently lost. Only one fragment survived, a navigation history. At 11:35 p.m., just 4 minutes after leaving work, the phone had briefly calculated directions to an address Emily had never visited before. 147 Old Cedar Road. The route calculation lasted less than 30 seconds before being canceled. Investigators immediately drove to the location. An abandoned farmhouse stood alone behind rusted fencing. Windows boarded. Roof partially collapsed. Power disconnected years earlier. According to county records, the property had been vacant for almost 17 years. Teenagers occasionally trespassed there. Hunters used nearby trails during deer season. Otherwise, nobody had reason to visit. Deputies searched every room. Dust covered nearly every surface. Animal nests filled empty closets. Broken furniture lay scattered beneath fallen ceiling beams. Nothing connected the house to Emily Carter. No fingerprints. No clothing. No blood. No personal belongings. The search ended in disappointment. Again. Detective Briggs stood on the porch before leaving. The farmhouse overlooked miles of empty desert. Wind pushed loose sheets of tin against an old equipment shed. Bang. 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 3 slow knocks. He froze. The sound. It wasn't identical, but it was close enough to send a chill through him. The shed door swung gently in the wind, striking a warped wooden support with deliberate, evenly spaced impacts. Knock. 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 Briggs walked toward it. Rusted hinges screamed as the wind shifted. Metal scraped against metal. Then 3 knocks again. His pulse quickened. Could the mysterious recording have captured nothing more sinister than an old structure moving in the wind? Or had someone deliberately chosen that location because they knew investigators would eventually hear exactly the same sound? He searched the shed personally. Inside stood only broken farm equipment, empty fuel cans, and decades of dust. No evidence. No hidden room. No answers. Yet something about the property unsettled him. He couldn't explain why. When he finally climbed back into his vehicle, he looked once more at the abandoned farmhouse disappearing beneath the evening sun. It felt, waiting, as though the building knew something everyone else had missed. The official report concluded there was no evidentiary connection between the farmhouse and Emily Carter's disappearance. The file was archived. Search teams moved elsewhere. Months became years. The farmhouse remained exactly where it had always been. Empty. Forgotten. Quiet. Until 20 years later, when a demolition crew preparing to tear it down broke through an interior wall. And a small brass key wrapped inside a yellowing piece of newspaper fell onto the floor.